Today, we'll be adding a footstep feature to our FPS character. Go ahead and load up the FPS template from our last tutorial, FPS running. If you haven't seen that video, there will be an annotation on screen now, or you can check the description of the video. Before we add another feature to our character, it's a good idea to start labeling our tool cards. You can see that even at this stage, our logic chains are getting increasingly complex. In addition, if we ever wanted to modify a piece of our character, we would need to figure out exactly what each tool card does. Labels can help us understand and keep track of these tool cards. For this tutorial, I will be using the extract function as a label. Unfortunately, this feature is unavailable in previous trials iterations, so I recommend mapping out your tool cards on paper. Even a simple flowchart on graph paper will help. To create our label, first spawn in any event. For labels, I normally use the end event. It has the least amount of options and is the least complex. Snap it above all your other tool cards. Under the object properties, select extract function. This will change the end event into a single function tool card. This function tool card acts as a mask, hiding the events underneath it. Deleting the function tool card will unhide the end event. The useful feature of function tool cards is that they can be renamed. Under the object properties, select name and give the function a default name. I will call mine label. Now, you can copy this function tool card whenever you need to label something. The amount of labeling that you do is up to you. I normally just label my variable data sources since they can represent many different things. I've just labeled our 5 variable data sources. I've called them gravity, sensitivity, pitch and yaw, and speed. To add footsteps to our character, we need to know when the sound of a footstep should be played. This kind of information is best contained in a state of movement. Spawn in a variable data source to represent this state and snap it above your other tool cards. I will label my variable data source move state. If you'll remember, we implemented a jump state with our jumping before combining it with our gravity data source. This new state will be similar, but it will encompass all the movements of our character. Now I'm going to use labels to list out the states of our character. Here, I've listed out all the possible states of our character: standing, walking, running, and falling. Jumping will be included in falling since they both take place in the air. Now, spawn in a set value event which will change our movement state. Select event target to be our move state. Copy this event and place one under each state label. Each of our states will have a number which represents that state. Change the value under each set value event to your chosen number. I will make standing 0, walking 1, running 2, and falling 3. Try to keep your numbers as positive integers so that you can recognize them easily. In order to determine which movement state our character is in, we will need to check some things. For this, we will be using the generic filter again, so spawn one in near our states. This generic filter is going to check whether we are standing on solid ground. To do this, change comparison value 1 to be our gravity data source, and change comparison value 2 to be the small negative number you use to represent gravity on solid ground. I use -200. This generic filter will now evaluate to true when standing on solid ground and false when we are falling. Falling is one of our states, so select false event to be the set value event under our falling state. Next, we need to check whether the character is currently trying to move on solid ground. For this, spawn in 2 generic filters to check our left joystick values to see if the player is pressing the left joystick. Under the second generic filter, assign comparison value 1 to our left stick vertical value. Under the third generic filter, assign comparison value 1 to our left stick horizontal value. Under our original generic filter, select true event to be the second generic filter. Under the second generic filter, select true event to be our third generic filter. Notice how the logic chain works. If our character is on solid ground, the original filter will evaluate to true and move to the second. If the left stick vertical value is 0, meaning the player is not pushing forward or back, then the second filter will evaluate to true and move to the third. Finally, if the left stick horizontal value is also 0, then our player must not be pressing the left joystick at all and our character should be standing still. This is one of our movement states, so select true event to be the set value event under our standing state. Our final check is going to be whether our character is walking or running. Spawn in another generic filter and assign comparison value 1 to our speed. Change comparison value 2 to your walking speed. Mine was 1200. This filter will now evaluate to true whenever walking and false whenever running. Since these are movement states, assign them their impulses. Select true event to be the set value event under walking and select false event to be the set value event under running. Under our last two generic filters that check the left joystick, select false event to be this final generic filter. If either of the left stick values are not 0, meaning the joystick is being pressed, then these filters will evaluate to false and the impulse will move to the final filter to check whether the character is walking or running. Now that our checks are in place, we need a trigger to activate these filters. Spawn in an interval trigger and snap it near your generic filters. Change the interval to 1 game tick and select event filter to be the first generic filter that checks our gravity. Our logic chain here is now done, but we need a way to monitor the state while playing. To do this, I'm going to use a counter. I will make a full tutorial later on how to properly use scores and counters, so for now just follow along. Press down on the D-pad to bring up the radial menu and select track settings in the top right. Select game mode settings. The game type should already be set to skill game if you watched the skill game setup tutorial, but if not, change it now. Open up the Set Scores tab and change the score element to Counter 1. Change the type to Data Source and set placement to Top Center. Leave everything else as is, but select Value Target to be our movement state. The words Counter 1 should now appear over our movement state. Now, back out of the track settings and test your track from the Start menu. Our movement state should be visible in the top center of the screen. Move around and make sure that each state has the correct number. 0 for standing, 1 for walking, 2 for running, and 3 for jumping and falling. With our movement state working, we can now add our footstep sound loop. Spawn in another interval trigger and a sound event from the events section. Sound events can turn sounds on and off as well as restart the sound. Under the interval trigger, change the interval to about half a second. I normally use 32 ticks. This interval will represent the time in between footsteps. Select Event Filter to be the sound event. Now, spawn in a sound source located under the Common Game section. There are many sounds to choose from, including a footstep sound in the Miscellaneous section. Unfortunately, this sound is part of the Trials Fusion DLC Riders of the Rustlands. For this reason, I will use a different sound from the base game. A good sound that has been present ever since Trials Evolution is the rock rumble light sound located in collapses and crashes. Change the pitch to a number above 30 for a good footstep sound, and adjust the volume to a desired level. Make sure to select static so that the sound is played at a constant volume, otherwise the volume will decrease as you move away from this sound source object. Finally, under the sound event, select sound sources to be our sound source object. You can test the sound loop by pressing the back button. You should hear what sounds like footsteps. Feel free to adjust the timing of the footsteps, but remember that this should be walking speed. We will add a running speed for footsteps in a moment. Also, try combining different sounds to get a good footstep sound. Just remember to select the new sound with the sound event when you do. We will now use our movement state to activate our footstep sound loop. Spawn in a state event from the Events section. State events simply turn other toolcards on and off. When a toolcard is off, it doesn't perform its designated action. This state event is going to turn our sound loop on and off. Under its object properties, select Event Target to be the interval trigger in our sound loop. Copy a state event for each of our movement states. Now, select Event Filter for the preceding set value events to each state event. Each should form a horizontal impulse chain as so. For the movement states that have footsteps, change the state event to on. This would be walking and running. The other two movement states, standing and falling, don't have footstep sounds, so leave their state events as off. You can test the track out from the Start menu. You should hear footsteps when running and walking, but no footsteps when standing or jumping or falling. Footsteps don't always occur at the same speed, such as when running. To change the speed, we need to change the interval between footstep sounds in the loop. Spawn in a variable data source which will represent this interval. I'm going to label this data source 2. Under the interval trigger, assign interval to the variable data source. Now, the interval of the footsteps can be changed with the data source. We will use our movement state to change it. Spawn in a set value event and select Event Target to be the data source. Copy a new set value event for each of the movement states. Then select Event Filter for the preceding state events to each new set value event. The impulse chain should continue to travel in a horizontal line. For the movement states that have footsteps, change the value of their set value event to the desired impulse for said movement state. I will use 32 game ticks for walking and 20 game ticks for running. The other movement states that don't have footsteps are fine as is. Go ahead and test your track from the Start menu. The footstep sound should pick up when you begin running and slow down when you return to walking. One of the problems that was present in our last video was that the character wouldn't stop very quickly, even after releasing the left joystick. We can solve this using the movement state. Spawn in a variable data source. This data source is going to represent the friction of our game character sphere, and I will label mine as such. Friction in Trials is the same as reality. The more friction, the harder it becomes to move an object. A large friction value will slow our character quickly. Spawn in a set value event and select Event Target to be this variable data source. Copy the set value event for each movement state. Then select Event Filter for the preceding set value event just as before. Make sure the impulses continue in their horizontal lines and that no event gets left out of the chain. Under the set value event that is in the standing movement line, change the value to 1000. 1000 is the maximum friction value for physical objects. With this setup, our character will smoothly glide over objects while moving, but become stagnant when standing. Finally, under our game character sphere in Advanced Physics, assign friction to this variable data source. Test your track out from the Start menu. Your character should walk and jump smoothly, but come to an abrupt halt when you let go of the left joystick. And that about wraps up our tutorial for today. Now, what we designed today, the movement state here, this is going to be one of the most important parts of our FPS because knowing what state you're in can lead to animations, adding more movements, and just creating, a better FPS. So this is going to be a really important part of the future, but we're done for today. So you can go ahead and save it off as an FPS template. If you guys have some more tutorials that you want me to make, leave them down in the comments below. I'll be going into some more advanced object position event stuff next week. We'll be adding some items to our FPS character. But that's about it. I've been Pneumatic Bog. Thanks for watching the tutorial, and I will see you guys next week.